Some of our viewers have said that they have heard that prayers that are prayed in Latin are particularly effective because our viewers say they have heard that Latin is the devil's least favorite language. So if we know prayers in Latin, we should pray them in Latin. Have you heard anything like this before?
I have, yes. I've heard exorcists point that out, that the Latin language does have a certain power over Satan, you know. Is it true? Well, there are those who are exorcists who claim it's true, and I believe it is true because the Church has given us, in the old Rituale Romanum, the book of blessings and exorcisms and so on, the Church gives us her ceremonies in Latin. I think that language is very agreeable to God, and I think it is very disagreeable to Satan. Now, that being said, I'd better clarify. You have the Carmina Burana. The Carmina Burana were the old drinking songs in the university days back in the Middle Ages, right? The students would get together in the taverns and they'd sing these Carmina Burana in Latin, and had a great time doing it. But they weren't necessarily edifying or very pleasing to God just because they were in Latin. I mean, you can say all kinds of awful things in Latin too. You know, there were some pretty awful works written in Latin. You know, even I understand that necromancers and wizards like to cast their spells in Latin, right? So that gives them some kind of added power. So we have to realize that language, any language, is a human thing. Remember, I mean, mankind spoke a common language until the Tower of Babel. And then just to humble the human race, as they were trying to build their ziggurat or whatever they were trying to, they build their way to heaven so they could take it by storm. God put an end to that just by mixing up their language. And all the languages and developed. One might even say the multiplicity of languages was not a good thing, you know, in its origins anyway. It was punishment for sin. So we have to be careful in making of it more than it is. I mean, language is language, but St. Paul does talk about speaking in the languages of men and of angels. He talks about angels communicating too. But he says that if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have charity, I'm becoming sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. In other words, I'm just banging on something, you know? It has no more significance than that. So not just the tongues of men, but the tongues of angels too. What is it that makes the sound of any language pleasing to God or displeasing to the devil? Would be charity. And so here in the Latin language, you have a language that has been used by the Church to express divine worship in the most powerful way possible, at the altar, the Holy Mass. That language has graced the churches for centuries and centuries. Now there you have the perfect charity of the Son of God offering himself in the holy sacrifice of the Mass. So that has to add great power, you know, supernaturally even. In fact, the pontiffs of the Church have told us that Latin, in a sense, has characteristics that are similar to the marks of the Church itself. You know, we're told that the four marks of the true Church are unity, right? Oneness, holiness, Catholicity, and apostolicity. These are the four marks of the Church. Well, you find these echoed, in a sense, in the Latin language. Sure, over the course of time, Latin did undergo the natural changes and developments, right? You read medieval Latin, it's not the same as Ciceronian Latin by any means. And yet there is a certain unity in the language that follows all the way through its history, especially the ecclesiastical Latin. There's a certain unity of that language that is remarkable, and continuity of that. It's a beautiful thing. That, you know, it truly is a Latin tongue. You know, we talk about the various idioms that spin off languages, but there's a remarkable unity in the Latin language. But you find also the holiness of the Latin language, and I mentioned that before in terms of the thoughts that were expressed in that language. This is the language of scholars and saints, you know, going back to the time of our Lord. I mean, it's quite magnificent. One can make an argument for Greek also. Of course, the language in which the New Testament scriptures are written and into which the Old Testament scriptures were translated miraculously in the Septuagint. So Greek, Koine Greek, has a certain character too. And you find the fathers of the church and the doctors of the church writing often in Greek as well. But here, for us, in the Roman Rite, in the Latin Rite of the church, we find the writings of St. Jerome, St. Augustine, and so many other great fathers of the church. We read them day by day in the divine office, in the breviary. There's a richness there. And they're writing about the faith and the hope and the love of God. So there's a certain sanctity that comes with that. It carries a message of sanctity, sanctification. Latin also has a Catholicity insofar as that it really was the language. Sure, I mean, Greek was the language of the educated class in our Lord's own time. I mean, even Peter, when he left Rome, he went to Antioch and was bishop there for 7 years. That was a preparation for what was to come next. He was called to Rome to defend the faith, and he spent the last 25 years of his life in Rome. What was he doing? He was preaching. What was he preaching? The gospel. In what language? In Greek. It was recorded by St. Mark. That's St. Mark's gospel. So, yes, Greek does have this certain character of universality in that regard, the language of the gospel. But one has to realize that the Latin really became the universal language of the Latin Rite, of the Roman Rite of the Church. And in that, it went all over the world through her missionaries. And that was something that really distinguished the Roman Rite of the Church, the missionary efforts that went out from Europe and here from America, the United States of America, over all those centuries. America went from being mission territory to being really a source of cultivation of the missions. And this was, again, it was carried in Latin throughout the world. And so we come to the final one, Catholicity, and this shows, or apostolicity. Again, you trace the writings of the church back into the very apostolic times. And we see that in many of the early documents of the church. It is you look at the old sacramentaries of the church, going back even to the Leonine sacramentary, going back to 400, which bore the worship of the church and, carried it one generation to the next and onward. Well, in any case, I think you get the point. There's something about Latin that it has been at the service of God in such a powerful way for so long. I think the devil does hate it. I think he does hate it. I think we human beings can kind of associate that with the fact that we associate certain languages with certain things. French and Latin, Italian and so on. We see a certain character in those languages. During World War II, German was almost anathematized because they were the enemy. And people would hear German and they would recoil, And now, we know that German is a language, right? And it has its own strengths. It has carried also, a great deal of good too. But we are almost primed to react to languages in certain ways by what we conceive that they have brought us, or what they've done to us, or what they've been used to benefit us or hurt us. Well, certainly Satan sees that in Latin, and he actually has just a terrible, not only distaste for it, but a disgust for it, because it has a kind of an odor of sanctity about it. It carries so many memories, right, for him. Exorcisms and prayers that have gone up against him, and the Holy Sacrifice. I mean, Latin was one of those languages that was expressed right on the plaque of the cross. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, Jesus Nazarenus, Rex Judaeorum, with the Greek and the Hebrew. So he does associate certain languages with his own defeat. And though also God, God himself can see, and the saints can see, in certain languages, that these were those that served God's purposes, the purposes of faith, hope, and charity. But yes, I do believe that Latin has a certain sanctity, and those who make the effort to pray in Latin are doing well. Those, are not only pleasing God, but I think they realize that Latin carries with it a kind of the death knell of Satan's work to condemn the soul. so many times. And souls were saved by the power of the sacraments, and notably penance and extreme unction, right? Snatched away from Satan's grasp. I think he does have a dread of Latin. Those exorcists who say that they tried the English prayers and they didn't find them to be very efficacious, and they then pick up the Latin ritual and they begin to use it in earnest, and they find out that the devil begins to pay attention. He recognizes, as it were, that voice, that he's heard over the centuries, and he cowers before that.